April 17th, 1945, a frozen railyard outside Munich. She had been chained for 5 days. No food, no water, no mercy. The Nazi officer who locked her there said she deserved it. Her crime? Telling fellow Germans they should surrender. For that, she was shackled to a metal bar inside a cattle car, left to die in the cold. 23 women were trapped with her, all of them waiting for death. Or worse, the Americans. The propaganda had warned them. Americans torture prisoners. Americans show no mercy. Americans are animals in uniform. So when Sergeant Emmett Crenshaw pulled open that rusted door, she expected a monster. Instead, he set down his rifle, crouched to her level, looked into her eyes, and asked one simple question. That question broke her, not with pain, not with fear, but with something she never expected from the enemy. Kindness. What did he ask? And why did 3 simple words shatter everything she believed? Stay with me. This story will change how you see humanity. If you love untold stories from history, please subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and watch until the end, because this woman's journey will stay with you long after the video ends. The railyard had no name anymore. Whatever the Germans had called it, some bureaucratic designation stamped on schedules and freight manifests, was gone now, erased by the same artillery that had cratered the switching station and twisted the signal towers into abstract sculptures of bent iron. By April 17, 1945, it was just another wound in the landscape, another scar left behind as the Third Reich bled out across Bavaria. Sergeant Emmett Crenshaw's patrol reached the yard at 7:40 hours. 12 men, tired, cold, their boots crunching on frost that still clung to the gravel despite the weak morning sun. They'd been walking since before dawn, following rail lines eastward, part of the massive clean-up operation that trailed behind General Patton's Third Army, like a broom sweeping up the debris of conquest. The fighting had moved on. What remained was the sorting, cataloguing what the retreating Wehrmacht had abandoned in their haste to escape the closing American pincers. Standard procedure. Check every building, every boxcar, every cellar. Look for hidden weapons, intelligence documents, stragglers who hadn't gotten the message that the war was over for them. Spread out, Crenshaw ordered, his Alabama drawl soft but carrying. 2 men per car. Check everything. Anything unusual, you call out. The statistics of collapse surrounded them. In the final months of the war, the German rail network had moved over 400,000 troops and countless tons of materiel in desperate, futile attempts to reinforce crumbling fronts. Now those same rails carried nothing. Locomotives sat cold and dead. Freight cars stood abandoned, their contents spilling onto the ground. Crates of machine parts, medical supplies, boxes of paperwork that would never reach their destinations. The smell hit them first, oil and rust, wet ash, something organic underneath that nobody wanted to identify. Private Merle Oxley, barely 20 years old and still uncomfortable in a helmet that looked borrowed from an older brother, gagged and turned away. The older men said nothing. They'd learned to breathe through their mouths. Cars 1 through 6 yielded nothing remarkable. Empty. Abandoned. Some had their doors hanging open like slack jaws. Others contained mundane cargo. Crates of ammunition with no guns to fire them, medical bandages that would never wrap wounds, stacks of Wehrmacht uniforms still wrapped in paper, waiting for soldiers who would never wear them. Then they reached the 7th car. Private First Class Reynaldo Estrada tried the door and found it locked, not just closed, chained. Heavy links wrapped around the exterior handles, secured with a padlock that gleamed dully in the grey morning light. "Sergeant," Estrada called out, "got something here." Crenshaw walked over, his rifle hanging easy at his side. He examined the chain, ran a finger along the cold metal. His brow furrowed. "Why would someone chain a cargo car from the outside?" he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Estrada shrugged. "Keep something in, maybe, or keep us out." Crenshaw stood there for a long moment, studying the sealed door. In 3 years of war, he'd learned to read situations the way his father had taught him to read weather back in Alabama, the way clouds gathered before a storm, the way stillness in the air meant something was coming. This felt wrong. The Wehrmacht abandoned equipment all the time now. They left tanks, artillery pieces, entire motor pools, but they didn't lock things up and throw away the key, not unless they were hiding something or leaving something to die. "Cut it," Crenshaw said quietly. Estrada pulled bolt cutters from his pack. The chain snapped with a metallic crack that echoed across the empty yard, sharp as a rifle shot. Birds scattered from a nearby roofline, their wings beating against the silence. Crenshaw gripped the door handle. The metal was ice cold, burning his palm even through his gloves. He pulled. The door slid open with a grinding screech of rusted wheels, and morning light flooded into the darkness within. The smell that poured out made Estrada step back, one hand covering his nose. Not death, thank God not death, but something almost as terrible. Unwashed bodies, human waste, sickness and fear given olfactory form. And then, as Crenshaw's eyes adjusted to the shadows, he saw them. Shapes, human shapes. Women huddled against the wooden walls, wrapped in torn blankets, staring at him with eyes that expected the worst. But one woman wasn't huddled with the others. One woman was chained to a metal support bar in the center of the car, her wrists shackled, her body frozen in a crouch that spoke of days without relief. And she was looking directly at him. The cattle car was freezing. No insulation, just wooden walls and a metal roof. Frost covered the inside corners. The women's breath came out in white clouds. Crenshaw counted them quickly. 23 women. Most wore torn Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, the grey-green of nurses, clerks, radio operators. Some had blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Others just sat in the dirty straw that covered the floor, staring at nothing. In one corner sat a bucket. That was their toilet. The smell came from there. But Crenshaw's eyes kept returning to the woman in the center. She was young, maybe mid-20s. Her nurse's uniform was filthy, torn at the shoulder, stained with blood. Whether hers or someone else's, he couldn't tell. Her dark blonde hair hung in matted strands around her face. Dirt streaked her cheeks. Metal shackles bound both wrists. A short chain connected them to the vertical support bar. The chain was too short for her to stand up fully, too short to sit down completely. She was stuck in a half-crouch, her legs trembling from exhaustion. When the door opened and light poured in, the women reacted differently. Some covered their faces as if expecting to be hit. Others just stared, too tired to care. A few whispered to each other in German, their voices barely audible. The chained woman looked up at Crenshaw. Her eyes were dark, sunken from lack of sleep and food. But they weren't empty. Fear lived there, yes, but also something else. A kind of stubborn defiance. She expected the worst. She'd been told what Americans did to prisoners, especially women. The Nazi propaganda had been relentless. By 1945, Joseph Goebbels' ministry was broadcasting warnings 24 hours a day. Americans would torture captured Germans, rape the women, leave them to die in ditches. Better to take cyanide than surrender to the Allies. This woman had believed those warnings. Every German had heard them, seen the posters, listened to the radio broadcasts. Now here she was, chained like an animal, and the enemy had found her. She braced herself for what came next. Crenshaw stood in the doorway. Behind him, Estrada and the others waited, watching. The sergeant was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by 3 years of war. He'd seen too much. Dead soldiers in frozen foxholes, destroyed cities, refugees walking in endless columns with everything they owned on their backs. But this was different. This was deliberate cruelty. Germans doing this to other Germans. He looked at the chained woman for a long moment. She looked back, waiting. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, her whole body tensed, ready for pain. Then Crenshaw did something nobody expected. He lowered his rifle, set it carefully against the doorframe, stepped inside the car slowly, carefully, like approaching a wounded animal that might bolt. He stopped a few feet from her. crouched down to her eye level, and in simple, clear English, knowing she probably wouldn't understand all the words, but hoping his tone would carry the meaning, he asked, "When did you last eat?" The question hung in the cold air. Not "Who are you?" Not "Why are you chained?" Not "Where are your commanders?" Just concern about her basic welfare. "When did you last eat?" The woman, her name was Annalisa Fogelsang, though Crenshaw didn't know that yet, stared at him. Her lips trembled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She'd been preparing herself for cruelty, for hatred, for violence. She'd built walls in her mind, preparing for whatever the Americans would do. The propaganda had taught her exactly what to expect, but this question, this simple human concern, completely broke through those walls. Tears began streaming down her dirty face. Her shoulders shook. She tried to speak, tried to answer, but all that came out was a sob, then another. Then she was crying openly, uncontrollably. All the fear and pain and exhaustion of the past 5 days pouring out in broken sobs. Crenshaw didn't move. He just stayed there, crouched in front of her, waiting. His face was calm, patient, not threatening. Behind him, Estrada shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't what any of them expected to find today. The other women in the car watched in silence. Some started crying too, not from fear anymore, from something else. Confusion, maybe. Disbelief. This wasn't the enemy they'd been promised. After several long minutes, Annalisa's crying subsided. She was still trembling, but she'd regained some control. She looked at Crenshaw through tear-blurred eyes. He was still there, still waiting, still looking at her like she was a person, not an enemy. Crenshaw stood up slowly, turned to his men. "Estrada, get the bolt cutters," he said quietly. "And someone radio back to command. Tell them we need medical personnel here, multiple civilian prisoners, at least one in bad shape." He looked back at Annalisa. "We're going to get you out of those chains." She didn't understand the word, but she understood the tone. For the first time in 5 days, something other than fear entered her heart. Hope. Estrada moved forward with the bolt cutters. Annalisa flinched when he approached. Her body went rigid. Crenshaw held up his hand in a calming gesture. "It's okay," he said softly. "We're going to help you." She didn't understand the words, but his tone was gentle. His movements were slow, careful, not threatening. Estrada positioned the bolt cutters around the chain connecting her shackles to the metal bar. He was careful not to touch her wrists. The blacksmith's son from El Paso had worked with metal his whole life. He knew how to cut without causing harm. One squeeze. The chain snapped. Suddenly, Annalisa could move. After 5 days locked in that half-crouch position, she could finally sit down properly. Her legs gave out immediately. She collapsed to the floor of the cattle car, unable to stand. The shackles were still on her wrists, connected by a short length of chain, but at least she wasn't bound to the bar anymore. She sat there, shaking, not from cold, from release. Crenshaw pulled a canteen from his belt. He unscrewed the cap and held it out to her. "Water," he said, gesturing to his mouth. "Drink." She stared at the canteen like it was a miracle. Her hand, shaking badly, reached out and took it. The metal was warm from being against his body. She brought it to her lips. The water was the most beautiful thing she'd ever tasted. She drank carefully, not frantically. Her body knew better than to drink too fast after days without water. But each swallow felt like life returning. She lowered the canteen after a few swallows and looked at Crenshaw again. Something different was in her eyes now. Not just fear, something else. Confusion, disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Americans weren't supposed to be kind. While this happened, other soldiers were helping the rest of the women out of the cattle car. Most could walk, though they moved slowly, stiffly. Their bodies were cramped from days of sitting in the cold. Waltraud Seidel, the oldest woman there at 44, needed support. 2 soldiers helped her down. She was a mother of 4 boys, all conscripted into the Wehrmacht, all missing now. She kept whispering the same phrase over and over in German. "They're helping us. They're actually helping us." Young Sieglinde Habermann, only 19, was still terrified. She pulled away from the soldiers at first, covering her face, but when they didn't hurt her, when they just waited patiently with their hands out to help her down, she finally took their hands. Helma Rothenberg, a nurse who'd collapsed from dehydration, couldn't stand at all. 2 soldiers made a stretcher from a blanket and carried her out gently. Within an hour, medical personnel arrived. Captain Vivian Calloway stepped out of a jeep, her uniform crisp despite the long drive. She was a no-nonsense woman from Richmond, Virginia. At 36, she'd seen her share of casualties in field hospitals across France and Germany. But even she paused when she saw the state of these prisoners. "Jesus Christ," she muttered. Then louder, "Okay, let's get them sorted. Anyone unconscious or unable to walk over here. Everyone else, we're doing basic medical checks." The German women were terrified of her at first. They didn't understand English commands. They assumed the worst. But Captain Calloway had dealt with frightened civilians before. She moved slowly, spoke softly, made sure to show them everything she was doing. A thermometer wasn't a weapon. A stethoscope wasn't a torture device. Just medical equipment. She crouched beside Anneliese, much like Crenshaw had done. The nurse noticed the shackles immediately. "We need to get those off," she said, looking at Estrada. "Can you cut them?" "Yes, ma'am," Estrada replied. But carefully, her wrists are torn up. The shackles had cut deep into Anneliese's wrists. The skin was raw, bleeding in places, infected in others. 5 days of those metal cuffs with no relief had left wounds that would scar. Captain Calloway cleaned the wounds as gently as possible. Anneliese still winced at every touch. "Who does this to their own people?" Calloway muttered to Crenshaw. It took Estrada 15 minutes to carefully cut through the shackles without hurting Anneliese further. When the metal finally fell away, Anneliese just stared at her freed wrists. She rubbed them gently, feeling the absence of weight. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. But she didn't make a sound this time. By noon, food arrived. The army field kitchen had prepared hot soup, bread, canned vegetables. Nothing fancy, but it was hot and plentiful. The German women were gathered in a cleared area near the railyard, sitting on blankets soldiers had laid out. They watched with wide eyes as metal cups of soup were distributed. The smell of food was overwhelming. According to military reports, the average German civilian ration in April 1945 was down to 1,000 calories per day. Many were getting far less. These women hadn't eaten in 4 days. Crenshaw personally brought a cup to Anneliese. She was sitting apart from the others, still looking dazed. When he held out the soup, she didn't take it at first. She just stared at it, then at him. Where was the trick? What did he want in return? "It's okay," Crenshaw said gently. "Just soup. You need to eat." Finally, she took the cup with both hands. It was warm, the first warm thing she'd held in days. She lifted it to her lips and sipped. The soup was thin, mostly broth with some vegetables and bits of meat. Nothing special, but to her it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. She drank slowly at first, then faster. She had to force herself to slow down again. Her stomach, empty for so long, rebelled at the sudden food. She felt nauseous, but she kept drinking. She needed this. Around her, the other women were having similar experiences. Some cried as they ate. Others laughed, short, desperate bursts of laughter that came from relief and disbelief. Waltraud Seidel kept repeating her phrase, "They're feeding us. They're actually feeding us." Everything they'd been told was a lie. The Americans weren't animals. They were just men. Men who gave water to the thirsty and food to the hungry. And that truth was harder to accept than any cruelty would have been. By late afternoon, arrangements were made. The women couldn't stay at the railyard. It was exposed and unsafe. A temporary camp had been set up 3 miles away in what used to be a German military barracks. The Wehrmacht had abandoned it during their retreat. Now it served as a holding area for prisoners of war and displaced persons. Trucks arrived to transport the women. They climbed aboard slowly, still weak. Anneliese was the last to board. Crenshaw offered his hand to help her up. She hesitated. just for a moment, then took it. His hand was warm, calloused, strong. He pulled her up effortlessly. "Thank you," she said quietly in German. "Danke," Crenshaw nodded. "You're welcome," he replied. The barracks was basic, but functional. Rows of beds with actual mattresses. Not straw pallets, real mattresses. Blankets, pillows. A washroom with running water. Cold water, yes, but running. Toilets that flush. After 5 days in that cattle car felt like luxury. Captain Calloway was there, overseeing everything. Through a German-speaking translator, she explained the rules. "Each of you gets a bed. We'll bring dinner in a few hours. There's a washroom down the hall. Please clean up if you can. We'll provide fresh clothes tomorrow." The women dispersed slowly. Some collapsed onto the mattresses immediately, not even removing their filthy clothes. Others headed straight for the washroom, desperate to feel clean again. Anneliese chose a bed near the window. She sat on the edge, testing the mattress. It was firm but comfortable, so different from the wooden floor of the cattle car. She lay back and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in days, she felt something close to safe. The days began to form a pattern. Wake at dawn with a bell, roll call in the yard, not for military discipline, but to make sure everyone was healthy and accounted for. Then breakfast, real breakfast, oatmeal, sometimes eggs, bread with butter, coffee. The women couldn't believe the amount of food. According to US Army records, each prisoner received approximately 2,000 calories per day, more than double what German civilians were getting. After breakfast, there were work assignments. Light work, nothing strenuous. The Americans needed help sorting through captured German documents, translating things, organizing supplies. The women with medical training, like Anneliese, were assigned to help in the camp infirmary. Her name, they learned, through the translator, was Anneliese Vogelsang. She'd grown up in a small town outside Stuttgart, daughter of a baker. She'd trained as a nurse before the war, worked in a civilian hospital until 1943, when the Wehrmacht conscripted all available medical personnel. She'd spent 2 years treating wounded soldiers, first in field hospitals near the Eastern Front, then in Germany itself as the Allies closed in. When the Reich collapsed, she'd tried to go home, but the roads were chaos, refugees everywhere, soldiers retreating, SS still executing deserters. Military police had picked her up, accused her of desertion, thrown her into that cattle car with the other women. The officer in charge had chained her specifically because she'd argued they should surrender instead of running. That defiance had earned her 5 days of suffering. Now, working in the American infirmary, Anneliese found herself in a strange position. She was helping care for wounded German prisoners under American supervision. Captain Calloway was her direct supervisor. The two women quickly developed a working relationship based on respect. Calloway was impressed by Anneliese's skills. Despite everything she'd been through, the young German nurse was competent, careful, compassionate, with patience. "You're good at this," Calloway told her one afternoon, watching as Anneliese expertly bandaged a soldier's leg wound. They communicated through a mix of simple English, basic German, and hand gestures. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. "Thank you," Anneliese said in careful English. She'd been picking up words quickly. The routine was strange but comforting. 3 meals a day, every day. Work that gave her purpose. A clean place to sleep. Hot water for washing. These were basics, things any human being should have. But after years of war, they felt like incredible luxuries. Then the letters started arriving. The mail system was chaos. Most of Germany's infrastructure had been destroyed. But the Red Cross was working to reconnect families. When a woman's name was called at mail distribution, everyone held their breath. Would it be good news or bad? Anneliese received her first letter 3 weeks after arriving at the camp. It was from her mother, written in shaky handwriting on a scrap of paper. Anneliese sat on her bed, hands trembling, as she unfolded it. The letter was brief. Her mother, Matilda, was alive, but barely. The bakery was gone, destroyed in an air raid. Her father, Conrad, was dead, killed in the same raid. Her younger brother Gustl, who'd been conscripted at age 16, was missing. Probably dead too, though no official word had come. The town was occupied by French troops now. There was no food. People were eating grass, tree bark, anything they could find. Her mother was living in the basement of a destroyed building with 5 other families, sharing what little they had. Anneliese read the letter 3 times. Tears streamed down her face. Then she looked around the barracks. Clean beds, warm blankets. She'd just eaten a dinner of beef stew and potatoes, more food in one meal than her mother probably saw in a week. The guilt was crushing. She was safe, well-fed, healthy. Her mother was starving. Her father was dead. Her brother was gone. And here she was, comfortable in an enemy prison camp. That night, she didn't eat dinner. She couldn't. The food turned her stomach. Captain Calloway noticed and pulled her aside. "What's wrong?" Calloway asked, concern in her voice. Anneliese showed her the letter. Calloway read it slowly, understanding enough despite the German. She handed it back, her face sad. "I'm sorry," Calloway said simply. "That's rough. My mother, hungry," Anneliese struggled with the English words. "I eat. No eat." Calloway nodded, understanding the problem. "I know it doesn't seem fair," she said, "but you starving yourself won't help her. You need to stay strong. Maybe someday you can help her, but not if you're dead." The logic made sense, but it didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. Similar scenes played out across the camp. Women receiving letters from devastated families, cities in ruins, loved ones dead or missing, hunger, cold, desperation. And yet here, in this American prison camp, life was almost normal. The contrast was impossible to reconcile. How could the enemy show more care for German prisoners than Germany had shown for its own people? 1 month into their imprisonment, the Americans gathered all the women in the main hall. A projector had been set up. White sheets hung on the wall as a makeshift screen. An American officer stood at the front. Through the translator, he spoke clearly. "We're going to show you something," he said. "Some of you may not want to see it, but we think you need to understand what your government did. What was done in your name." The women looked at each other nervously. What was this about? The lights went out. The projector started clicking. For the next hour, they watched footage from the liberated concentration camps. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, mountains of bodies, stacked like firewood, thousands of them, so many that Allied soldiers had to use bulldozers to move them into mass graves. Living skeletons staring at cameras with hollow eyes, men and women so thin their bones showed through their skin, children who looked like old people, people who weighed 60 pounds but were somehow still alive, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoriums with bones still inside, barbed wire, guard towers, piles of shoes, mountains of human hair, gold teeth extracted from corpses. The footage showed American and British soldiers forcing German civilians from nearby towns to walk through the camps to see what had been done. Women covered their mouths in horror. Men turned away, unable to look, but the camera kept rolling. The bodies kept appearing. The numbers appeared on screen. Over 6 million Jews murdered. Millions more Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet POWs. The largest organized mass murder in human history. In the dark hall, some German women looked away. Others cried. Waltraud Seidel fainted and had to be carried out. Anneliese watched it all. Tears streamed down her face, but she couldn't look away. Her hands gripped the edge of her chair so hard her knuckles turned white. Young Sieglinde, who'd clung to Nazi beliefs even after capture, stared at the screen in shock. Her mouth hung open. When the lights came back on, the room was silent. Absolute, crushing silence. Someone whispered in German, we didn't know. But the American officer heard her. Through the translator, he replied, maybe you didn't, but someone knew, a lot of people knew, and now you know too. You can never say you didn't know. His voice wasn't angry, just firm, factual. The women filed out slowly. Nobody spoke. What could they say? That night, the barracks was different. The women who'd still defended the Reich, who'd insisted Germany had been right, were quieter now. Some still claimed the footage was fake, propaganda, lies meant to justify Allied victory, but their voices were weaker, less certain. Anneliese couldn't sleep. She kept seeing those images, those bodies, those faces. How had it happened? How had an entire nation allowed this? The answer, she realized, was that they'd chosen not to see. It was easier to believe the propaganda, to focus on their own problems, to convince themselves that surely it couldn't be as bad as people said. She'd done the same thing. She'd heard whispers about camps, about deportations, about disappearances. Jewish families who'd lived in her town for generations, suddenly gone one night. But she'd told herself it wasn't her problem. She was just a nurse. She just helped people. She wasn't responsible. But silence was complicity. Not acting was a choice. She understood that now. The next day, Sergeant Crenshaw found her sitting alone outside the infirmary, staring at nothing. "You saw the film," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "It's a lot to take in," he said quietly. "How do you—" She struggled for the English words. "How do you forgive after seeing that?" Crenshaw was quiet for a long time. "I don't forgive what was done," he said finally. "I can't. Nobody can. But you." He looked at her. "You're not responsible for that. You didn't do it. You didn't even know about it." "But I should have known," she insisted, her English getting better from weeks of practice. "I should have asked questions. I should have—" "You should have." "Yes," Crenshaw agreed, surprising her. "But you didn't. None of you did. And you can't change that now. What you can do is make sure it never happens again. You can make sure you never stay silent again. That's the only way forward." She understood then why he'd asked that first question. Back at the cattle car. When did you last eat? It hadn't been about intelligence gathering. It hadn't been about establishing dominance. It had been simple human compassion. He'd seen a suffering person and wanted to help. That was the difference. That was what her government had lost. The ability to see enemies as human beings. The Americans hadn't lost that. Despite everything, despite all the death and destruction, they still saw people. "Why did you ask me?" she said suddenly. "That first day when you found me. Why did you ask when I ate?" Crenshaw smiled slightly. "Because you looked hungry," he said simply. "And because everyone deserves to eat. Even prisoners. Even enemies. That's what makes us different." She felt tears on her face again, but they were different this time. Not tears of grief or guilt. Something else. Maybe hope. Maybe the beginning of healing. She'd been taught to hate Americans, to fear them, to see them as barbaric monsters, but they'd shown her more humanity than her own government ever had, and that was the truth she'd carry for the rest of her life. The truth that kindness was stronger than propaganda, that compassion could break through walls of hatred, that sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't a gun or a bomb, it was a simple question. When did you last eat? 6 months after liberation, the war in Europe was over. Japan had surrendered. The world was beginning the long process of rebuilding. In the camp, preparations were being made for repatriation. Most German prisoners would be sent home once authorities determined they weren't war criminals and had somewhere to go. Anneliese's turn came on a grey November morning. She was called to the administration office and told that arrangements had been made. Her mother was still alive, still in that small town outside Stuttgart. Anneliese could go home. She should have been happy. She'd been dreaming of this moment for months, but instead she felt strangely empty. That evening she found Crenshaw. He was off duty, sitting outside the headquarters building, smoking a cigarette. "I'm leaving," she told him in English. Her accent was still thick, but her grammar had improved dramatically. "They say I can go home next week," Crenshaw nodded. "That's good. You must be relieved." "Yes," she said. Then more honestly, "No, I don't know." He gestured to the spot beside him. She sat down. "What's wrong?" he asked. She struggled to put it into words. "When I came here, I thought I knew who I was. German nurse, loyal to my country. But now—" She trailed off. "Now you don't know," Crenshaw finished for her. "Everything I believed was wrong," she said. "Everything I was taught. Everything I thought I knew about the world. It was all lies. And I didn't question it. I just accepted it. So don't accept things without questioning them anymore, Crenshaw. That's what you learned here. That's what you take home with you. But how do I live in Germany? She asked. How do I go back to a place that did those things? How do I look people in the eye, knowing what happened? The same way everyone else will, Crenshaw replied. By trying to be better, by building something new, by making sure it never happens again. He paused. Germany will need people like you. People who understand what went wrong and want to fix it. She looked at him. This American sergeant who'd shown her more kindness than her own government ever had. I want to thank you, she said, for everything, for cutting me free, for treating me like a person, for asking when I last ate. Crenshaw smiled. You don't have to thank me for basic decency. That should be the standard, not the exception. In my country, it became the exception, she said, quietly. That's the problem. They sat in silence, watching the sun set over the camp. The week before departure, Annalisa packed her few belongings. The Americans had given her new clothes to replace her torn uniform. She had letters from Captain Calloway recommending her as a skilled nurse. She had addresses of aid organizations that could help her and her mother, but she was terrified. What would Germany be like now? The journey back took 3 days. She traveled with other repatriated prisoners, all of them nervous and uncertain. When they crossed into Germany through the American zone, the reality hit them. The destruction was beyond imagining. Cities that had once been proud and beautiful were now just rubble. Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Mannheim, all reduced to broken shells. People lived in the ruin, trying to rebuild with whatever they could find. When Annalisa finally reached her hometown, she barely recognized it. The main street was gone. The church was a pile of stone. Her father's bakery was a crater. She found her mother in the basement she'd mentioned in her letter. The woman who greeted her was thin, almost skeletal, her hair completely grey. She was only 48, but looked 70. Annalise, her mother whispered, as if she couldn't believe it. Mama, Annalise said. And then they were holding each other, both crying. That night, as they sat in the cold basement sharing food Annalise had brought from the camp, her mother asked the question Annalise dreading. How were the Americans? Were they cruel? Annalise could have lied. It would have been easier, but she'd promised herself. No more silence. No more looking away from truth. No, she said honestly. They were kind. They fed us, gave us medical care, treated us like people. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then we were told lies about that too, she said finally, along with everything else. Annalisa stayed in her hometown, found work in a makeshift hospital treating injured and sick civilians. Conditions were terrible, limited supplies, no heat, not enough staff. But she did what she could. The skills she'd learned in the American camp served her well. Years later, when Germany had begun to rebuild, when the worst of the hunger had passed, Annalisa married a local teacher. They had 2 children. She told them stories about the war, about what had happened, about the lessons she'd learned. Never stop questioning, she told them. Never accept cruelty as normal. Never dehumanize people, even your enemies. That's how it all went wrong. That's how good people did terrible things. She never saw Sergeant Emmett Crenshaw again. She didn't know if he went home safely. Soldiers were shipped back to America, disappeared into civilian life. But she thought about him often, about that first question, about the kindness he'd shown when he could just as easily have shown cruelty. That moment had changed her life. It had broken through the propaganda, forced her to see the enemy as human, and in doing so, forced her to question everything she'd been taught. A simple question, when did you last eat, became the turning point. Not the liberation itself, not the food or medical care or clean bed, but the basic human decency behind that question, the recognition that even enemies deserve compassion. For Annalisa Vogelsang, that moment in the cattle car was both an ending and a beginning, the end of blind faith in propaganda, the beginning of understanding that humanity transcends nationality, that compassion is stronger than hatred, that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simple kindness. As she told her grandchildren many years later, I was prepared for cruelty. I'd built walls against it, But kindness. Kindness broke through every defense I had. It forced me to see the truth, that people are people, no matter what uniform they wear. And once you see that, you can never go back to hating. The war ended, the prisoners went home, life moved on. But the lesson remained. In our darkest moments, what we choose to ask each other, how we choose to treat each other, can change everything. That's the story worth remembering. A German nurse chained in a cattle car, an American sergeant who asked about her well-being instead of her sins, and a simple act of human decency that proved more powerful than years of propaganda.